So it's a great pleasure to ask Hilary Greaves to moderate this panel and to open the session. So Hilary is a colleague from the philosophy department, and she will clearly show that they have also something to say about making choices and thinking about it. And I'm very pleased that she's here to actually moderate this panel, and she'll introduce the other speakers. Thank you.
Okay, thanks to everyone for coming. So this closing panel discussion is very much complementary to the keynote speech that we had from Rachel Glenister yesterday. So Rachel was talking about the case for evidence-based interventions, why you should do them, how you should do them. Here, if you like, we want to approach things for the other direction and ask the question of whether there are limits to that process. Are there limits to how far the evidence-based approach can be pushed, and are there limits to how far it should be pushed? So to speak to us on this, we have Michael Kremer, Gates Professor of Developing Societies at the Department of Economics at Harvard, Justin Sandefur for the Centre of Global Development, a Senior Fellow, Eva Vivalt, Lecturer at the Australian National University, and Joseph Ssentongo, a Senior Evaluator at the Global Innovation Fund. In terms of format, we'll ask each of our panellists to speak for about 5 minutes on their overall thoughts on this theme. Then I'll feed some questions to the panellists, and after that we'll open it up to the floor for questions that you would like to pose to our panellists. So Michael, if you'd like to go first.
Great, thank you. Thanks. So I might be biased, but I tend to very much agree with the points that Rachel made in her talk yesterday. I think let me start with just saying that I think evidence on causal effects should be seen as part of a much larger system, both for good research and for understanding the world, but also for policy. So as Rachel noted, just taking the understanding the world part first, you need descriptive data, you need theory, you need a rich qualitative understanding of the context in which you're working. And I see evidence as complementary with all those things, not as a substitute. And of course, there are multiple techniques to get at causal inference. It's not all about RCTs. And I think within the research community, there's actually a pretty wide, pretty common understanding of this, and I don't even think it's controversial anymore, or I don't even know how often it was controversial. So if I think within my own department and my own colleagues in development, Nathan Nunn, Melissa Dell, Gautam Rao, Emily Breza, some of these use RCTs frequently, some hardly ever use them. It's typically driven by the particular problem that they're working on. It's not, I really can't recall a time when it was ever an instance of friction or division. It's really, a bit of a non-issue, I would say. Now, for policy, I think something, it's a different list, but I think similar principle applies. If you're thinking about a new policy, you need piloting, you need careful attention to implementation details, you need feedback loops, you need careful thinking about stakeholder incentives, you need a lot of diplomacy, a lot of listening, and evidence is part of that picture as well of what's needed. So there's been a lot of philosophical discussions on the role of research and evidence in policy. I think it'd be useful to just try to move this to a more nuanced discussion rather than the sort of combative discussion that often exists. I think it's also useful to try to inform that by data. So let me try to present some data. I'll note this is descriptive data, not experimental. Don't know whether I can make causal claims here. But yesterday, Rachel briefly mentioned an analysis of the early portfolio of USAID's Development Innovation Ventures. So I thought I'd say a little bit more about that. So DIV is an innovation funder. For disclosure, I was involved in setting it up, and I'm still involved with it. It takes time for innovations to scale, but DIV's been around long enough that I think we can now start to look at the track record of how investments are doing in terms of scaling and other things. I should note that the idea of DIV from the beginning was very much that evidence is part of a larger process. That it's very important, but it's also part of a larger process. So DIV has 3 phases of funding. The first phase is for piloting, and that's really before an RCT or any rigorous impact evaluation. It's important to try out the innovation, get feedback that can be obtained by talking to users, other stakeholders. It's not until after that phase that we actually even envisioned a second phase of funding, which is for rigorous impact and cost effectiveness, or, and this is an important or, to demonstrate that an innovation can pass a market test. So, in some cases, we really don't need impact evaluations. If somebody develops a solar lantern and customers are willing to pay for that, I think we can appeal to theory of revealed preference and the likely direction of any externalities to argue that this is likely to be a good thing. But in other cases where continuing public subsidy is needed, it probably does make sense to, where possible, try to get that evidence. So then the third phase, after either the market test or the evidence of impact and cost effectiveness, is to try to transition that to scale. And transitioning to scale involves adaptation, it needs refinement, it involves bringing down costs. It might or might not involve another round of testing to see if the adapted form works. It requires a lot of talking to clients. It's not, things won't stay the same, and they shouldn't stay the same. So we tried to, while DIV doesn't always require evidence, we have a variety of types of projects, some of which involve researcher involvement and RCTs, some of which don't. Those are very highly correlated concepts. I'm not going to try to tease out the effect. But in our first 2 years, we funded 42 projects. 25 of them had researcher involvement or some form of evidence. 17 didn't. They were often sort of social entrepreneurship projects. And when we look at the data, one thing we looked at, and this is joint work with Esther Duflo, first thing we did was we tried to look at which projects reached over 1 million users, either in their original form or adapted form. And that's not necessarily enough to prove that something's useful, but to get a high rate of social return, it's going to be necessary to reach some scale, because think of the number of people reached times the benefit per person. What we found was, of the 25 innovations that had researcher involvement in some and/or some RCT element, 6 of them reached over 1 million users so far. And I should emphasize that that's really across a range of different scale-up channels. Some were startup firms, some were working with large existing firms, some with NGOs, one with a political party, others with governments. Of the 17 innovations that we supported that didn't involve researcher involvement or evidence, none of them are scaled. Now, there's room to quibble about, how do you count and so on. But this, huge dichotomy it's very hard to see that data and come to the conclusion, which I think some people sort of assume that researchers, despite the fact that we're not necessarily good at tying our shoelaces and so on, that to come to the conclusion that they're not useful at actually reaching things that scale. I think if I think about what we don't know, and which is what gave rise to those patterns. One hypothesis is that the evidence was really the critical factor, and that collecting evidence is really important. And that's what persuaded people to scale. That's possible, I can't rule that out, but I actually suspect that it's many of the other things that are associated with the research mentality and the research culture that also played an important role. Development economics researchers are trained in theory. They have to get through the first 2 years of grad school. They're trained to they're exposed to a lot of new ideas. They're trained to question their own ideas a lot. They're expected to present their research and to present that in front of audiences that are going to be tough audiences where it's hard to BS. They're told to question themselves all the time, and they're also modern development economists are perhaps more than the rest of the profession are really trained to go spend time in the field, spend time with pilot things, spend time with users, talk to them about what's really going on. I think all those habits of mind may well play a role in the success of researchers in this. So I guess to conclude, I think evidence can play a really important role, but I think it should be seen as part of a package, not as an either or. So thank you.
Thank you. You'll probably hear a lot of similarities between my presentation and what Michael said. First and foremost, I want to say that I'm delighted to be on this panel, both as an African and as someone working in evaluation. The research that a lot of you on this panel and in this room do is very important in confronting the limits of evidence-based interventions and really helps inform the approach of organizations like ours. So I work for the Global Innovation Fund, which is a $200 million nonprofit fund investing in innovations that are targeted towards people living under $5 a day in low and middle income countries. We have a venture capital approach, which means that we're willing to take bets, but our focus is on maximizing social returns, not on maximizing our returns. Currently, out of 32 projects, we have 17 which are based on the African continent, and we've done this whilst having evidence at the core of our model. I think I will try and illustrate how GIF navigates the challenges of evidence-based interventions by illustrating a few features of our approach, which I think are very relevant. The three features of the approach I want to illustrate are being entrepreneurial ed, secondly, being flexible about evidence, and thirdly, being pragmatic in how we think of impact assessment. So what do I mean by being entrepreneurial ed? You can contrast this to being strategy-driven. At GIF, we don't sit in our offices in London or Washington, D.C., thinking, what is the theory of change about this subsector, and where are the gaps? What can we do to help? We prefer instead to engage with entrepreneurs and their ideas and think of ways that we can help them achieve measurable impact at scale. Now, our definition of innovators and entrepreneurs is actually quite broad. So I'm not speaking of tech evangelists in an innovation hub in Cape Town, Accra, or the Nairobis of this world. An innovator and an entrepreneur can be the policymaker in Ouagadougou who is tired of the status quo, or the academic at Makerere University who is ready to apply their knowledge to real-world problems. So my guess is that this room has quite a few entrepreneurs. The second point is about being flexible about evidence. So we follow a venture-style stage funding approach, which means that more speculative innovations attract smaller support, whilst larger funds follow successful testing and achievement of proof points. Of course, we're cognizant that achieving scale for our innovations involves factors beyond the innovation itself. So what we try to do is to say, what are the main constraints for you to achieve that scale, and what can we do to help you relax those constraints? This can take many forms. For a policymaker, it might be rigorous evidence about cost effectiveness. In a different case, it can be proving that a certain product can reach a specific price point. And in a different case, it can be simply that whether a team is able to deliver quality service for 100,000 people when they're currently delivering quality service for 100 people. And the third feature that I want to highlight is pragmatism in our impact assessment. So as a $200 million fund, an impact metric is clearly necessary to measure what social benefits we're yielding. So we figured out, we developed a system that will help us forecast, update, and track the prospective social impact of our projects and portfolio. We call this practical impact assessment. Practical impact assessment isn't just about measuring the number of people reached, but instead we're trying to capture the people impacted, the depth of the impact, and the uncertainty surrounding whether the innovation can reach scale. The challenge for us is not whether a given innovation yields 9.6% social returns or 10.6%. We're trying to identify the 100% returns vis-a-vis the 1%. We find that this order of magnitude approach is working for us. I think I can summarize our impact approach by saying that our approach is we prefer to approximate to have an approximate answer to the correct policy problem, as opposed to trying to have precise answers to the wrong question. Thank you.
Hello. So I would agree with things that have been said to date here. I think that we are constantly improving, and as more and more studies have been generated, there's been a lot of interesting work synthesizing the results in various ways and really growing from that. Not necessarily, in some naive sense, but trying to really model what's going on in the world. And as more evidence is generated, that helps. Obviously, there are still going to be some differences between what we find in an experimental or quasi-experimental setting and what's relevant in a particular situation. And there's lots of reasons for this, maybe some of which Justin might talk about, I'm not sure. Things like site selection, bias, etc. There's loads of reasons. But I'm going to focus my comments on two particular issues where I think there's some room for improvement. And these are more general statements about the disconnect that there can sometimes be between evidence and the policy decisions at the end. One is that researchers have different incentives, and part of that is we're very focused generally on getting unbiased estimates. If you're familiar with the bias-variance trade-off, that's not necessarily the best thing for policymaking. So overall, your error is going to be some function of how much bias you have, variance, and some other idiosyncratic errors. And so by minimizing the bias, we're not necessarily minimizing prediction error overall. And this is an issue, if you think of all the common estimation strategies that researchers use, we're really obsessed with getting unbiased estimates, myself included. So this is one place where it's not even necessarily clear that it's wrong for researchers to be so focused on getting unbiased estimates. There was an interesting point made, I think, by Michael a few days ago at a different workshop, that, it's could be the case that researchers should do the proper unbiased thing, trying to, convince the maximally skeptical individual in the audience, and that policymakers should do something a little bit different when considering, all this evidence together. But that is, I think, an under-considered issue, because I think that, I would be a little bit nervous about trusting the nice unbiased estimates directly from research. I mean, they're only unbiased if you're not considering things like site selection bias, etc., publication bias, specification searching, all those things. So that's point one. The second point, where I think there's a lot of room for improvement, is in actually taking priors somewhat seriously. So people know a lot of stuff, and we go in and we do some kind of study, but reality is very complicated, and it's hard to say whether, in fact, priors can be at least somewhat informative when you're moving from one setting to another. I don't think this has been, rigorously looked at in any systematic way. I personally would be very interested in knowing how much, we can trust things like priors, things like observational data, and how they compare to the results of both experimental and quasi-experimental results. And where are the differences, and are there, can we sort of predict a priori where we're going to see those discrepancies? Because if we could actually figure out relatively low-cost, easy ways of getting a quick sense of what the effects of a program will be, that would be great. That would expand what we could say considerably, because we can't always do a study all the time everywhere. So I'm not trying to say that, these things would be as nicely unbiased as the proper academic studies, but that there could still be some value to them. And it's worth further investigation. And, apart from all the other reasons why priors are great, like helping to improve research transparency, because then, people are more interested in your null results, or, helping with enabling research on how people are updating and interpreting evidence and using that, etc. So those are my 2 points for improvement.
Am I on? I am. All right. So 2 points, hopefully in 5 minutes. I want to claim, I think, basically just repeating Michael's first point, that if there was an RCT war, and I actually probably think there probably was more of one, but I agree with him that I think the RCT wars are over, and I think we have sort of a neo-randomista post-RCT war sort of consensus in development practice emerging, and I want to talk about what that looks like. And then my second point is I want to propose kind of what the missing piece is going forward, and one simple solution to this whole thinking big versus thinking small dichotomy, or how we contextualize our findings, or how to get greater take-up by African policymakers, and the whole thing in one shot here. So immodestly, the model that both Michael and Joseph talked about is a model of pilot testing and scaling. That's at the heart of DIV. That's at the heart of GIF. And so the kind of the history of some of the concerns from the sidelines is, as Eva mentioned, is a set of things that I kind of want to run through just to put them out on the table. We're having a whole conversation about this topic, and we haven't actually explicitly said what were the concerns that were generating this. But I think they've now become sort of the central focus of ongoing experimental work and work to take evidence to scale. Like these, what used to be, if we were ever ignoring these concerns, I think we're certainly not anymore. So group these under kind of where we're working, who we're working with, how many and how big we're working, and then what it is that we're actually looking at. So the where, one of the constant concerns is about context matters, external validity, and what do we do about that? Are we jumping too quickly from a result in one place to taking it elsewhere? I mean, I think there's fairly straightforward brute force solutions to this problem that are becoming more and more common, which is, replicate, 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 and we eventually we wear ourselves down into thinking that microcredit didn't produce any results, and so replication is one solution. The other solution, even more brute force, a recent JEP piece by Karthik Muralidharan and Paul Niehaus is, just work from representative samples, sample from a giant population and your results are representative of that population and make no, external validity claims. Again, brute force solutions. But on the who, if we're worried about randomization bias and that we work with implementers that are particularly good, or that implementation is going to fail when we move from an NGO to a government, obviously there is one solution of, again, the Karthik and Paul solution, which is evaluate and experiment with giant government programs at scale, right? And you're working with the organization that can work at scale, and you're doing it over millions of households or millions of beneficiaries, and you sort of put all of those intellectual concerns to rest. As an academic, nice work if you can get it, but but let's come back to whether or not how practical it is from a policy point of view. And, Banerjee et al. In a recent paper on scaling up the teaching at the right level work that Rachel Glenister mentioned yesterday, has this statement that any sort of phase 2 work in the div kind of GIF jargon evaluation needs to be working with the organization which is going to be responsible for working at scale. So I think these kinds of things are now, commonly adopted. If you're worried about the how many, that scale per se is big, again, you can evaluate programs at scale, or you can randomize over big units. Again, if you're Karthik and you get the budget, you can randomize across districts and study your market equilibrium effects and your spillovers that way. The last point, though, is the kind of what it is, and is microcredit just microcredit, or is it an interest rate that varies from 0 to 100, and group lending versus individual lending, and lots of many, much smaller details. I think those we're pretty clear on, and we can design theory-driven experiments to get at some of those, but there are smaller details that might be more important than we think. So Esther Duflo's Eli lecture at the AEA a year ago put forward, many of you have heard this idea of economists as plumbers. And so if scientists create the general frames, and the engineers kind of design the machines, then the plumbers have to make those machines work in the messy reality, and it's bespoke work designed to fit into the context. And includes these fairly strong statements that scientists are sort of trained to ignore details and to work out general principles, and so scientists are unlikely to be the ones who are going to see and put forward, see the obstacles and overcome the obstacles to policy success. And for that we need plumbers who are deeply immersed in the details of a specific program and recognizing that, printing the price on the Raskin card in the Indonesian rice transfer program made all the difference in the world to the leakage and so on. I put a lot of stock in this idea that those details matter, and working with governments at scale as a way to have scale matters for total return, as Michael pointed out. So that brings us to how do we get more of this done in Africa to improve policy making in the region? And I think my simple solution to all of the the problems that I listed at the beginning is going to be training and investing in more African plumbers, essentially. So I think a couple of years ago, Greaves Chelwa, I don't know if Greaves is in the audience, Zambian economist who might not be here, wrote a provocative blog post about does economics have an Africa problem, which was was just harassing this conference a little bit from being in Oxford, and I think Marcus was here earlier, harassing the World Bank's Africa annual conference on Africa for being in the Bay Area and so on. And I wrote a post at the time kind of looking at the topics that African academics who are here work on compared to non-African academics, and there is sort of a divide. It kind of lines up macro-micro, but not quite. There's some nuance there. I wouldn't have predicted, all the divergence, but there are differences in areas of interest. And in terms of experimental work, I had my RA kind of go back to the top 30 journals over the last decade or so. Experimental work on Africa by academics based in Africa is still pretty much non-existent. Lots of reasons for that. So I think we need to invest in more of this. And if, I really liked, again, Rachel Gunner's framing yesterday that, not all of our research generates high returns and big policy impacts, but a few hits that generate really high returns sort of pay for the whole thing. And I think that applies to kind of the investment in African research organizations and African researchers as well. And so Benno Ndula was supposed to be on this panel, but I think had a conflict in the end. Governor Ndula is not around. So, an influential African policymaker from Tanzania. I used to work in the shadow of his offices in Dar es Salaam. So trained at Northwestern, a career at the bank, then became governor of the Bank of Tanzania in 2008 with double-digit and rising inflation over the following decade. Brought inflation down to 5%, achieved 7% growth rates over a decade. And so if Benno had even a small contribution to that, it's enormous human gain from that investment in his training and career. He also helped, set up work with the AERC, and I think it's interesting to look at the portfolio of work that the AERC does and how it's a little bit different than the kinds of things we tend to talk about here. A book on capital flight from the region, which is more about, how Western countries that we typically portray here as donors are, a hindrance to development of the region, but also systematic work on the service delivery indicators, systematic work on descriptives and diagnostic, capacity building around the SDI, so training local researchers to use those things. So in sum, I think if the consensus is that context and implementation details matter, and we need to focus on those, and we need to work with governments, and basically be plumbers, then I think both the doing and the getting take-up of that research points in the direction of training more African plumbers who are going to be attuned to those details and are eventually going to sit on the other side of the table and listen and take those things up. Let me stop there.
Okay, great. Well, thanks to all four of you for those excellent presentations. So just before we open up for questions from the floor, I'll see if I can channel a few of the concerns that maybe quite a few people here have. Firstly, picking up on the comment that Joseph made about wanting an approximate answer to the right question rather than a precise answer to the wrong question, do you think there's any validity to the following kind of line of thought? The line of thought would be, so what the evidence-based approach seems to be particularly good at, or at least this is the impression you'll get if you go to the individual presentations by individual researchers presenting their evidence. What it seems to be particularly good at and particularly used for is kind of focusing on the nitty-gritty questions of detail, like how do we get children to spend a few more years in school, how do we get people to actually take up healthcare interventions that are offered, and so forth. Insofar as I'm the policymaker on the ground whose concern is more with the big picture, long-run things. Right, I've got this country, I want to increase economic growth on a timescale of a generation, I want to generate large-scale job creation, and so forth. Do you think that the evidence-based approach is equally useful in that bigger picture context, or is it kind of selectively useful for the smaller questions? Maybe that's in the first instance a question to Joseph, but also to any of you.
Thank you. I think when we think of how relevant evidence can be for these sort of more macro problems, the approach that the GIF takes is to say, right, what we're approximating is, we have studies. Let me give a concrete example. We have a project we support in Ghana, which is Lively Minds. It's trying to improve early childhood development. And the studies that we have that sort of have evidence, showing that this sort of intervention works, are based in, completely different settings. We have Jamaica, we have one in the United States of America. So when I say that we're approximating, what I mean is that we're using. We can't say that the point estimate that applies to Jamaica applies to the Ghanaian context, But our approach is to then try and say, can we test this in the real world setting? And that is what we're doing. So we're trying in 2 regions of Ghana to see, this is where this type of innovation will scale through. And if it is going to be taken up, if this is going to be successful, the results won't be done through a pristine environment of an NGO, but through the Ghana Education Service. So we try to sort of take this evidence that is approximate, but that we know, based on priors, that it's likely to have some sort of effect, a positive effect on early childhood outcomes, and then apply it to a messy setting, a messy real-world setting. And I think this is an exciting way to sort of try and bridge the gap of evidence not really applying on a macro stage. So success in that case would be scaling up at a national level, but we wait to see what the results from studies carried out will show about the outcomes for these students.
Thanks. Do any of the other 3 of you want to come in on that? I noticed you were writing a lot.
I'll do a bit. So I think that there's certainly some questions that you just can't get at with randomized controlled trials, for example. Examples of that, just to mention a couple of my colleagues, Nathan Nunn has done a lot of work on the impact of the slave trade on Africa. That's obviously not something that one can do RCTs on. Melissa Dahl has done work on the impact of U.S. bombing during the Vietnam War that might have implications for current U.S. foreign policy. Again, not subject to RCTs. But while that's true, I also think that RCTs can be used we're learning that they can be used much more broadly than, certainly than I thought, at the outset of the RCT movement in development economics. You see work on things like corruption by Ben Olken, by Fred Fanon. There's work on politics. The fact that you could randomize whether debates were held for political office and look at the impact on political outcomes, that's not something that I certainly would have guessed was possible. You mentioned economic growth in particular, so let me just highlight one other way that RCTs can be used. A lot of it's true, it's very difficult to use. We think monetary policy, for example, might be very important for economic growth, and we can't use RCT to get at that. But I'll give an example of one set of issues which is very important in debates about economic growth. There are a lot of people who think that getting manufactured exports is really important because getting manufactured exports will get learning by doing, and some of the benefits of that learning by doing will spill over to other firms. So there's recently been very nice RCT done in Egypt that looks exactly at this question. Now, what they in fact find some evidence for this. That sheds light on, the purpose of that RCT is not at all, I think this was looking at carpets. We should not be subsidizing I don't think the answer is, the Egyptian government should subsidize exports of carpets. I don't think that's what that was just a tool to get at a general phenomenon. And, the implication might be that, that Bangladesh might want to consider subsidies for exports of new goods. I don't know what the right implication is. A lot of other thought needs to go into that. But I think this is another very important point of research and a way that research can affect policy. Not immediately by saying, go scale up this policy, but by creating learning that then informs the rest of what we're doing. And so, I agreed with a lot of what Justin said, but one area where there might be at least a little bit of one thing I'd like to sort of append on to that at least is that it's great if you can implement with governments at scale, but there's sometimes when you want to implement when you have incredibly good implementation And you just have to bear in mind what you're doing it for. So I was, I was working with some health researchers once who were studying hand washing, and they were sending people into the households 3 times a week to get them to wash their hands. And if we thought about that the way development economists often do, we would say, this is ridiculous. That's totally, you can't scale that policy. But they weren't doing it for that reason. They were trying to understand what diseases does hand washing affect. And then they would separately think about what's the right policy to scale hand washing. And so I think there may be cases where research like that is warranted and can also have an important policy impact. And I guess just practically, if I think about some things that have been scaled, and I think I think successfully, often they come from things that were not initially done with the large-scale implementer. Because as you pointed out, there are political constraints on what large-scale implementers can do. So I think of the work that James Habyarimana and Billy Jack did, for example. This was work on putting stickers in matatus and minibuses to tell passengers to speak up if they're not driving safely. This was initially done very much as a research project, and then later they worked very hard with policymakers in both the private sector and public sector to try to scale this up, and they're testing it at larger scale to see whether the effects hold off. And so I think that's an example. I think there are many other examples where that type of research can be useful. Incidentally, it does support your other point that James isn't. He's not based in Africa, but he's a researcher, from Africa who's very aware of what's going on and has ideas like that.
Okay, so here's another question which maybe follows on naturally from one of the things Michael said there. So insofar as the picture that emerges is RCTs and similar forms of evidence can be used to inform a wider domain than maybe you think, but there are still going to be some places where they basically don't apply or they don't apply very much. Then we're going to face this issue of, well, what do we do about that in terms of our prioritization decisions? Do you think there's any legitimacy to preferentially focusing on those areas of intervention where relatively solid evidence is available so that we really feel we know what we're doing, we know what works? Or do you think there's a danger that if we go too far in that direction, we will end up neglecting things which have the unfortunate property that they're harder to investigate using the same kind of techniques? For example, could this lead to us neglecting conflict states where perhaps the need is greatest because, say, it's politically impossible to do the trials in that country and the external validity problems are too hard, are too severe for evidence elsewhere to be relevant? In other words, will we be justified in looking under the lamppost, or do we need to be bold in cases where there are some domains that might be really important? We might be able to do really effective things there, but it's really hard for us to work out in advance which things are effective and which ones aren't. Again, not to anyone in particular. So.
Well, actually, I guess the value of information does tend to be higher when you've got lots of uncertainty. So, in that sense, sure, we should do more things that are looking for the ones where we don't yet know, and it might be particularly difficult to get good evidence. And the other thing is that, there's obviously a wide array of ways to think about this, but I once was talking to a policymaker who said, well, I don't care if there's statistical significance. I just want to know that this particular thing has a reasonable chance of doing a good job, compared to the outside option. And, I guess if you're Bayesian, that makes a lot of sense. We don't need particular p-values just to have a bit of, some addition, and some uncertainty seems to be okay under that kind of framework.
I'll jump in on that. I'll take the bait. But I'm not going to be super fun because I think I don't think we're going to get a lot of disagreement here. I think, there is this common critique that if academia is pushing us in the direction of experimental methods or other well-identified forms of causal inference, this isn't really about experiments, that, basically we're all kind of large-end quantitative researchers here, and that we're going to tend to devote our attention to looking at individuated programs, and thus there's going to be disproportionate focus on these things. I guess, I do a lot of my work in education. I don't think I make any apologies about, working on education or think it's not important because it's kind of has individuated benefits and is susceptible to these kinds of methods. And to Michael's point, I think many of the things that we care about can also, with some creativity, be subjected to similar methods. I think, in terms of the context, are we going to be tempted to look under the lamppost in terms of a certain context? There's this paper, by Art Cray and others at the bank, kind of saying that for the success of a World Bank project, the task team leader's fixed effect is bigger than the country fixed effect, right? And so, country context maybe matters, less than the details of the project and the implementation. So I don't know. I'm less concerned with that, especially as we recognize that we're veering into a little bit of focusing narrowly on the question of experimental methods, whereas the question is about an evidence-based approach. And I can see colleagues from the IMF in the audience who are like, hey, we do evidence-based policy. It's not particularly controversial that we make decisions based on evidence. It's a different kind of evidence, but nobody's suggesting that we spend less time on monetary policy because it can't be studied with these methods. So I don't know.
Okay, so next maybe a question that is a challenge to the researchers, if you like. So we all know what academic researchers do when they write their grant applications. They try to make the case that the experiment or similar thing that they're proposing, that the funding body fund, is the most important thing. Clearly this is a bottleneck. We just need to get this research done, and then everything will be better. So in the direction of sort of skepticism about that, I guess the question is, to what extent do you think it's really true in the policy context or other spheres of practical action trying to make things better, that the bottleneck at the moment tends to be not having enough evidence available versus other things? So, what other things might we be talking about here? We might be talking about whether policymakers both care enough about evidence and are in a position where they're able to pay sufficient attention to evidence. Picking up on Rachel Glenister's point yesterday, that it's crucial if you're a researcher trying to actually get things to happen, that you have a good policy partner. And one of the features to finding a good policy partner is this person has to actually plan to make decisions based on what direction the evidence points, and not based on, say, political ideology or what they thought worked before they started listening to you or anything else. And then for a second suggestion of where the bottleneck might turn out to be something other than how much evidence is available, can there be cases where we already basically know the intervention works, that's not the problem. The bottleneck is more that we don't yet have the operational capacity in terms of, say, team size or organizational structure to scale up the things that we already know works. So if you were the funder, in other words, you're not the researcher, you're the funder, and you have a choice about whether to fund the researcher's work or things that would push in some of these other directions, which do you think, in your experience in general, is the higher priority at the moment?
Let me take a stab at some of that. So, look, if I could do one, what's a bigger problem for the world? Lack of evidence, or human greed and fallibility and warlikeness? Clearly, all of those human failures, I would rather get rid of those. If we could wave a magic wand and get rid of them, that would be wonderful. And similarly, there are a lot of things where there's quite a degree of consensus within the economics field and more broadly that certain policy changes would be desirable, and they're not taking place because there's very strong political interest or political ideology against them. But let me distinguish that question from a separate question that you asked, which is, if you're a funder, what would you do? And there, I think I would actually look at I cited some of the data on the things which scaled from what DIV funded. But if I look, the real question you ask is, what's the social rate of return to different types of investments? And we've also attempted to create lower bounds on that social rate of return. And extremely conservative lower bounds on the social rate of return to those investments yield, very high benefit cost ratios, 3 to 1, and those are sort of assuming that there's no future benefit of any of these innovations, just including what's happened up till now, that many other things. So I think if I think about development spending, I'm restricting things to international development right now. If I think about international development spending in general at places like the World Bank, et cetera, or country, I think that's actually a very high rate of return. So I think that funding innovation, and perhaps we're an innovation funder, not a research funder more broadly, but certainly the innovation area, I think there's actually some evidence of a high rate of return. I expect the same thing would also be true for broader research funding.
I'll jump in I would sort of maybe push back on the idea that a policymaker on the African continent is not willing to digest evidence. If we think of something like business environment reforms, now I'm not going to jump into controversies about methodology, etc., but in this case, the funder is the African government, and the amount of resources in the last 10 years that have gone towards investment climate or business environment reforms based on a ranking is quite extraordinary. But this ranking that the World Bank produced resonates and speaks to the policymaker. So maybe we should provocatively think of it as the researcher not producing the type of evidence that is relevant to the policymaker.
I can't resist. So I'm just going to return with a question, not an answer to your question. But so you mentioned implicitly, I think, the Doing Business Index at the bank, which has been in the news of late. And so amidst the kind of doing business, so for those of you who didn't follow, there was this controversy. Paul Romer, the chief economist of the World Bank, started criticizing the World Bank's own product. Lots of people rallied to the defense of the Doing Business Index, and I attended a panel at another think tank in Washington, D.C. recently, which, the Doing Business Index is introduced as the most impactful thing that the World Bank does. It is, the major product of the World Bank Research Department. It is what the World Bank Research Department is known for on Capitol Hill, is the Doing Business Index. And to your point, there's all these claims from people with a direct line to the White House, that it has incredible influence over policy. Now, I would also contend that it's wrong, in its substance, in terms of how it measures, the ease of doing business on a de jure basis, and lots of other quibbles. And there is a question there about an attention to the accuracy of the evidence versus that policy impact. But it also speaks to me about a difference between the only kind of evidence that has a big impact being evidence of the effectiveness of policies, whereas doing business is a model of having huge policy impact by just describing the reality. And back on every theme, it seems like, was covered by Rachel Gunner's presentation yesterday. But the importance of bringing descriptive evidence, just describing the state of policy play has, for better or for worse, had enormous impact, probably more than, a slew of good evaluations we could have done on specific business reforms. I feel like, when two kinds of groups of economists that I tend to interact with and dialogue with a lot are the folks working on, impact evaluations and the health and education literature, which is all about, causal inference evidence, and the other group is sort of the poverty and inequality, Piketty and acolytes crowd who have also had enormous influence of late on policy conversation by virtue of measuring descriptives. So, you know, I think we shouldn't de-emphasize that element of the policy relevant evidence as well.
Okay, so last one from me, so get your hands ready. In Eva's presentation at the beginning, she offered a couple of helpful suggestions to the research community. So insofar as you're a researcher and you want to move your work or your research culture in directions that make your work more helpful to policymakers, Eva's suggestions concerned which directions research practice could usefully be moved relative to where it is now. I was just wondering whether any of the others of you had suggestions for that. If you wanted to critique the research community, give it a better set of norms or a better set of concerns that would make it more helpful to policy decisions, do you have any suggestions for what directions of motion would be useful? You can say no.
Yeah, let me pick up on the previous discussion and try and answer your question at the same time. So, you know, just on this question of will policymakers listen, I think, sure, there are a lot of cases where policymakers, you know, won't listen or can't listen because they face too many constraints, or they have ideological preconceptions, or certain policymakers, you know, have other objectives. But there are also a bunch of policymakers who I think can be very, very open to evidence. And it just takes a few. You know, if you take this point, research by and large is very cheap. So if you just if 1 out of 5 or 1 out of 20 or 1 out of 100 research projects winds up influencing policy and does so sufficiently, that can easily pay for itself. But in terms of points for, just to connect this up, let me to your question. I think policymakers are often facing a bunch of non-ideological, non-interest group, very, very practical questions. I guess this connects to the plumbing point. So I was recently talking to some policymakers who are involved in trying to do mobile phone agricultural extension. They have a big mobile phone agricultural extension program. And they asked some researchers to take a look at the data on this program, and very quickly you could identify just some very basic things that were problems. I'll just give you an example, just to emphasize the boringness of this. When the system would say press 1 for this, press 2 for that, press 3 for that, and if you didn't answer within 10 seconds, it hung up on you. Well, an alternative, and these were rural farmers, they may not have been used to these systems. An alternative would be to say, well, how about after 4 seconds, you repeat the message? Okay? Now, that's super boring, but that's something that a policymaker can definitely listen to. And if that cuts the hang-up rate by 3 percentage points, then, and you're talking about a large country, this could ultimately have a pretty big impact on welfare. So there are tons of, in my view, there are tons and tons of questions like that. And these particular policymakers were extremely open. They really wanted to know the answer. They were really concerned about this, and they really wanted to know how to improve their system. I think not every policymaker is like that, but I think plenty of them are. So what's the lesson for researchers on that? Well, I think there's a tendency for researchers to say, is this economics? Am I going to be able to publish this? That sounds really boring. I don't think it is boring, actually. I think it's fascinating. And I think just because it's not something that you've seen 20, I think there's sometimes researchers fall in the trap of, I need 20 articles published in this, and I'm going to publish the 21st and switch it in a slightly different direction. And I think that is an easy trap to fall in that's probably reduces both policy impact and research impact. I'll give you an example, from my own work, which is, working on education, I tended to think a lot about questions that are standard for economists to ask. What's the impact of spending more money on education? What's the impact of incentives for teachers? Those are interesting, important questions. But actually, the thing that really sort of was much bigger and really stared us in the face was that there was a mismatch between what was being taught and what the students already knew and what they were ready to go on to next. And this is, teaching at the right level. Well, that doesn't sound like economics. Maybe that's pedagogy. But actually, if you think about it for a while, there's a whole bunch of political economy behind that. There are ways that you can model that. There are ways you can rigorously test that. And there was no problem. Once it took that work to do that, but once that work was done, there was no problem publishing any of the stuff in good journals. So I guess I would suggest to focus on the real world problems, whatever they are, and not say, does this fit into an established model or paradigm? If it doesn't, that's actually a greater opportunity for you. Go out and write the model. So that would be my advice.
Okay, so let's open up then to questions from the floor. Obviously, I won't know most people's names, but raise your hands and keep them raised for a while. I'll try and remember a few places. Someone has to be brave and go first. Come on. Okay, over there. Thanks.
Thank you so much. This was really interesting. So, Joseph talked about the importance of research for policy, and some research is fine for researchers to do, but it's not really useful for policymakers. And then Eva talked about the obsession of researchers in unbiased estimates, etc. But I'm sure many here are thinking it and probably have not going to say it, but there are many stakeholders for a researcher, especially early career researcher, that are not only policymakers, but it's also many of us here will have a research assessment exercise soon, and the weight of impact on policymaking is much less than publishing output. So I think one thing is also to think about how sensitized are journal editors, many of them will be here today, and how sensitized are the profession as a whole to reduce this obsession with significance and unbiased estimates, if you think that's important, to reconcile the two. Otherwise, it's impossible for people to produce output that will, satisfy both. But anyway, thank you so much.
So there was a question down here at the front.
What do you think is a disciplinary norm that exists in another discipline that's not economics that you think is really healthy and you'd like to see brought into economics?
Anke Höfler, CSAE. I've been involved in the Copenhagen Consensus Project, where everybody was asked to sort of address a problem of global importance, and then these were ranked according to benefit-cost ratios. And so Michael was sort of saying when you have to choose, then you sort of, it's not actually difficult to choose, if I understood you correctly, because the benefit-cost ratios are really high. Well, health always wins hands down, yeah? So you have a rehydration solution for a child and you save that child's life. But what about the environment? What about conflict? What about, any of these sort of things that are very, very difficult to what discount rates are appropriate here? How do we really want to sort of compare these sort of, I think Hilary was sort of much clearer on sort of, and I would also like to see a push much more on this sort of, the problems with systems, I understand that in a lot of countries, the political economy situation is so difficult that the beauty for me with the RCTs has been, even in these difficult situations, you can do something good, yeah, for those people there. But to sort of make really big progress, you've got to do something about the political economy situation, and that I don't see happening, and I don't see happening with this particularly narrow focus on some, what we call evidence-based interventions here. Thank you.
So we have a collection of questions built up there. Let me just throw them all open to the panel for anyone to pick up on any of them in no particular order.
I'll do a quick response on the first one. I'm not sure, since I'm not a tenure track academic, I can speak externally. I'm not really sure that as academics you should wish it upon yourself that you were more beholden to policymakers for your evaluation than fellow researchers. Not only is there value to pure science, but there's value to academics judging the merit of the work you're putting out rather than letting the policymakers be the ones to decide that, I think. I'm going to stop there.
Yeah, I guess with regards to the big questions like environmental concerns, et cetera, that are so hard to get to and so important. I mean, I am optimistic that some combination of smaller studies and a lot of modeling can help get some of the way. Obviously, I guess you have to add a lot more assumptions in your models to try to get at some of the big things that you can't directly test. And I think that's fine. And I think that, we should be trying to build good models and trying to, figure out good ways to do that. I mean, I think the bigger types of issues are probably, I would agree, they can be some of the most important ones and are very hard to study. Michael was referencing innovation earlier. There's lots of things that we just have yet to innovate on that, could add a lot of benefit.
So, just let me just extend the comment that I was made earlier. I think clearly problems of conflict are vitally important. And do I think that quantitative studies or by economists I think we probably can contribute some on some issues, but work by political scientists is probably more central to understanding political conflict than work by economists. And there's probably lots of very important qualitative work that can be done. At the same time, I think there have been quite surprising and important advances on things like understanding the impact of community-driven development programs, understanding the contact hypothesis and the ability of that to reduce ethnic conflict, understanding the importance of different of informing voters, of debates I mentioned earlier. So I think there are areas where there can be progress here, and I don't think it's an either or. And there's also, you mentioned the issue of what's the appropriate discount rate. Maybe that's an issue for economic theory or for philosophy, and completely, you need work there as well. You mentioned the health always wins. I agree that health always wins, and I think that's a little bit of a problem, to which I don't think that I have the tools the World Health Organization declared that I think 3 GDPs, a DALI is worth 3 GDP per capita, and with a thin veneer of justification from Jeff Sachs. And why does the World Health Organization get to decide that? I assume the education people would have their own views about the relative importance. I have no idea what a DALI is worth. I don't really trust revealed preference estimates of that either, but I agree, it's a problem. I don't say it's a problem. I don't think we should accept that on faith. On norms from other disciplines, one thing that I've done work on education, and as we heard, economists are very obsessed with identification, identifying causal impact, to make sure that the test score estimates that are being estimated are the exact, are unbiased and precise. The education researchers say, what's that test score? What does it mean? What are you measuring there? Is there any content to that? Unfortunately, I think that, and they've spent a lot of time thinking about how do we validate that, et cetera. Unfortunately, I think we're probably both right, that the studies that don't have causal identification may often be really problematic, and the studies that have a test where we don't know what it measures may be problematic. So I think we need to, unfortunately, try to improve on both dimensions simultaneously, which takes a lot of hard work. But I think that's, people are moving in that direction.
Can I?
We'll try just doing one question and then let people answer before they forget what the questions are, just in case their brains are as bad as mine.
Right, I think, so Justin, mentioned at some point about the importance of having more researchers and research coming out of Africa, right? And the question is, how do we get to do it? So if a lot of the funders sometimes impose on you that you have a local researcher. What ends up happening is that you put somebody's name who does not have any say in what you're doing, right? But even apart from the fact that a lot of the research is not coming out of Africa, and there's a difference in the kind of research that the Africans are doing and the others are doing in Europe or America, but within the developed world, a lot of the research comes out of the same set of universities, and the most of the funding goes to the same sort of universities. So do you think there is also a risk that the ideas that we get are there's a chance that a particular type of ideology just gets promoted because it's the same set of people who are producing the evidence, as opposed to a wider set of people from a wider set of countries, from a wider from a wider group producing research?
So, can I?
Do you want to?
It's in a similar vein, a question.
Okay.
So I'll do that because it's a bit building. So it builds on a bit of a comment that I think Justin and Joseph both made in different ways. Is that with the way research has evolved and the importance of intervention-based research and learning from this, we maybe as economists we've become a bit more scientific. A bit more in its organization, with bigger teams, with economies of scale to projects, to kind of much larger operations that are doing and maybe contributing to the thing that Joseph was referring to. On the other hand, comments were made, and I think Rachel was making it on Monday as well, and other people commented from the floor then as well. For influence and for changing societies, you do want it to be, you want the stakeholders to be involved in it, and you could say, I'll have a workshop with them and sit around the table, but that's not the same as forms of, whatever it would mean, that at least some locally produced knowledge that then reflected the context that actually builds in the political economy and so on. So in a way, if that's the way to influence, the latter is the way to influence, how do we square this with a model that has far more focus, that the economies of scale are getting so big, and a business model of how we're doing it? Or do you have any ideas of the business model of how we can actually square getting in Africa more Africans involved, getting more included in it? And, to be honest, there used to be, I do think research used to be in some sense more democratic. When I started, okay, that's close to an embarrassing story, is that my sample had 78 households and I did a PhD on it, okay? It's a long time ago. But I was in some sense quote-unquote democratic in the sense that a lot of African scholars, when I started teaching in the University of Addis Ababa, could do studies of 500, 300, 400 people, and they could write papers and they could actually compete with research. Now, that's not possible anymore. It's a very different type of thing, and we lose that democracy in research, we lose that inclusion in research with all these economies of scale, while we're claiming this is much more important from the policy and changing societies there. So how do we square that?
Other than to cheer people on, I don't have solutions. I'm hoping somebody else on the panel is going to have them. But I think just to turn it back around as a question, I think we're going to find, attention to context and attention to implementation and, the details at hand are motherhood and apple pie. I don't think anybody stands against those things. And I guess, where the rubber hits the road and things get really tough is when we have finite research budgets and we have to decide about, allocating, I don't know how ESRC does it. Somebody in the room may, and when DFID, and now that you've left the building, Stefan, you can speak freely, how DFID allocates its research monies between, leading research centers in the UK or elsewhere and investing in say, go back to my Tanzania example, are there any RAPOA people in the audience, so, and maybe it's telling if there aren't, actually. So the leading kind of research organizations in country. I think some of that work has gotten a bad rap of late, and it's becoming, we have to take a fairly long horizon lens to investing in those places, and that's a longer term horizon of research investment than, the short-term grant proposal for a certain study that you get, but I'm hoping we can be kind of take a long-term view there. I mean, there was a question about, are things getting captured by a particular, ideology or so on. I guess I'm motivated in making these comments less by thinking that there's ideological capture in a certain direction, and just thinking that a more diverse, set of people and more local organizations are going to raise different questions and are going to be more, in dialogue with local policymakers, both in question formulation, but also in, the take-up of the results on the other end.
I'll say a little bit. I don't think that the current system of saying, well, we've got funding and we need a researcher from column A and a researcher from column B is necessarily working very well. I think that it would be useful to think about more creative and other approaches to addressing this very important issue. One thing that I don't think any of us in this room have any influence over, if research is a global public good, and there's no particular reason why the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes of Health in the US, and the relevant EU bodies should be funding just researchers from their own countries. They should, if there's a way to cure cancer, that's going to benefit people all over the world. And yes, if we fund research in San Diego, it might be a San Diego company, biotech company that helps, but that's not really the real point of it. We should find the best researchers in the world. It should be open. I think there should be some sort of system to have research grants be open to around the world. And, second issue is, somebody mentioned African researchers based in Africa. I think it's also important, to the extent one of the purposes, there are a lot of understandable, strong incentives for African researchers to seek positions internationally. And I think trying to encourage that group of African researchers and make sure there are opportunities for them is very useful. And so sort of only counting African researchers based in Africa when there are these counts, maybe you need two separate categories, African researchers based in Africa and other African researchers, but I think there's room for both. I think I'm not so sure that that you're right that as you move to research that has more and more expensive because you need a bigger sample size, etc., that may price out some researchers. But there's another possible way that this could be. It could actually have a positive effect eventually, and that's. There was an earlier question about practices of other disciplines. So other disciplines, the real sciences, they tend to have very long lists of authors because they're very complicated projects, certainly in medicine, and you need lots of different specialized skills. And if you're measuring different outcomes, you may need somebody who's an expert in measuring each one of those outcomes, and they're all co-authors. And that means that and as we move to sufficiently complicated projects, we might wind up with longer lists of co-authors. And I don't mean just because you're tacking people on who don't deserve to be there. It's because it's connected to the other one. Just like you need to measure test scores right, well, you need to measure health outcomes right, and you need to measure a bunch of things right. And I don't mean this is just about measurement. I mean, there's as teams, if we switch to norms where lots of people get recognition for the really important roles they play in studies, rather than a set of 3 PIs then that may also help create a ladder through which people can start off with one role in a publication. If they do well, they get more, and they get recognition for the work that they did, which is often really critical to the study. And finally, I think there needs to be some system to improve access to graduate training in leading PhD programs. Often, pipelines develop. So there's the CCER in China. There used to be top economics programs were reluctant to admit that many students from China, but then this sort of accrediting body developed, and I think we need, that's not yet functioning very well, with some exceptions for Africa, and some sort of pipeline needs to be developed.
Just as a quick two-finger on that, I think if you look at pretty much any field, starting a little bit younger with support is always going to help, right? Like if you think about, it's even, before grad school, right? It would certainly help to have more support. If you think of things, gender bias, etc., any kind of bias, like you would get, exponentially harder to offer enough support the older people get. So starting young somehow.
As an African based in London, I would challenge the African researchers in this audience to tackle this. In a way, it's paradoxical that this is the panel that is asked to answer this question. I think the answer lies with you, the researchers, and you have a better idea.
Do we still have a question at the front here?
Well, I'm still much more a policymaker than I am a researcher, and so it's been really interesting to me to see all of the navel-gazing and hand-wringing among the researchers about how to have policy impact. I suppose my question is really, what exactly do you think policymakers are optimizing or maximizing here? It's the mental model in a lot of this discussion seems to be that we either take the time to or don't take the time to read or listen to research, either process it or don't process it, and then either act on it or don't act on it and improve our policies. It's a much, much more complex process where you might use research to sort of scare somebody off doing something quite bad, or as a footnote in something that gets sent in some formal process to a minister making a decision, just as a way of stopping them from doing something that you think is quite harmful, and that their incentives are that they don't want to get hauled up in front of a committee and asked, why did you ignore the research that was presented to you? And I don't get the sense that the margin that we're going to move policymakers in is an incremental improvement in our methods or a slightly better way of selecting which papers get published or anything like that. It's probably going to be, actually Eva's presentation yesterday was a bit about this, a much better understanding of how evidence actually gets used and how we actually translate that into the decisions we try and get people above us to make. And I'm just wondering if any of you had any sort of insights into what sort of, I know Eva does, but actually, if any of you have any other insights of sort of, why isn't that a sort of important margin in economic research? It doesn't seem to be that big to me. It's kind of good because that's what I'm doing my sort of research on, but...
come back on that before we get another
one? I will only make one comment in response, which is, as somebody who works at a policy think tank, I don't think it's the direct answer to your point in question, but and maybe the academics who are being asked to do policy impact stuff in the UK will agree with this. I mean, I do think there is some room for specialization here, right? I think it's silly for us to demand of all academic researchers that they have full understanding of the research to policy process, and that's why other organizations exist, and some, Michael Kremer has gone out and worked in the policy world, but not all publishing academics really have to do that. And I think sometimes when we're asking academics to do that, we are incredibly naive and we push them into naive models about how they're going to disseminate their research, and it's going to be taken up.
I mean, I would agree that not everybody has got to do this, but I also agree that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit here, I think. At least in my experience, when I previously worked at the World Bank and would talk to people in various countries, it seemed like very often, we all are thinking a lot about evidence, but there's actually still, I think, quite a lot of people who are not, and who are, basing their decisions based off of, what their friend told them in the hallway or something like that, and a better understanding of how exactly people are, I think there's quite a lot still to be done there, for sure.
Did you want to wrap up? Did you want to wrap up? Last question.
Okay, thank you very much. So first of all, I want to thank Justin. So I'm witness Mbanagai from AERC. So I really appreciate you sort of acknowledging the work that AERC has been doing and it continues to do. So I just want to buttress the point that I think building the capacity of African researchers is actually indispensable for the simple reason that, of course, they do live the experience. And also what you want is to create capacity that even allows for collaborations, meaningful collaborations with researchers from the North. So I think at the moment, our sense is that there's less emphasis on capacity building and more on sort of maybe project type research, which is a concern to us in that regard. But the other point I wanted to bring up is when you think of limits to evidence-based interventions, so of course, policymakers have got certain priorities, but probably researchers might have different priorities. And also in some sense, the priorities for researchers might be responding to maybe even donor sort of priorities, which is they want to fund the research in certain areas. But those areas might not necessarily be at that particular point in time the key issues that the policymakers are facing. So it might actually sort of have impact on uptake or willingness of policymakers to actually go the extra mile to implement those things because they are not at that point in time their priority areas. So I don't know how you sort of what you think about that kind of potential disconnect between the priorities of the researchers given the funding that they're getting and the priorities of the policymakers. Thank you.
I'm not sure, other than to end with the 3 cheers for the AERC, whether I have much more that I can add to that. I think it brings us back to this question about, and I may overreach here, so in our last chance to speak, that in as much as we think take-up matters and we think the contextual details matter, it seems like a switch of topic, but I feel like all of those arguments in the methodological discussions actually also push us in favor of needing local research institutions involved, not just in the answering of questions, but also in the framing and posing of questions to get the kinds of questions that we're asking joined up with those priorities. Not everything. I mean, there's basic science that are global public goods that, you know, the Ebola vaccine didn't need to be developed by people living near Ebola. It could be developed elsewhere and it's just as effective. But, you know, so that need for contextualization and local participation is going to differ by question. But, yeah, I think we're on the same page here.
Yeah, I think that having a rich understanding of how research influences policy is a very useful thing and actually a fruitful topic for research. Maybe not, you know, I agree with Justin that not every researcher will be good at that research, and I don't know whether, or should even try. But let me make a couple of sort of non-scientific observations on this. I think it's often the case that there's a bandwagon effect. That certain, you know, I don't think the typical policymaker is necessarily very focused on evidence in the way that, you know, researchers would like to imagine that they are. But I do think that there are some policymakers who are pretty open to thinking in that way. And sometimes the policy, and I also think that there are intermediary institutions which are like that. So think tanks can play that role. I also really stress that international organizations can play that role. So I think the clearest example of that is the World Health Organization, where really a big part of what they do is they digest the evidence and they make recommendations, and then the health official in a particular country, they don't need to say, I'm going to figure this out for myself. They say, well, the World Health Organization endorsed it, and maybe I know 6 other neighboring countries are doing it, and, you know, that's good enough, I'm going to try this as well. And obviously sometimes that might lead them astray for the reasons of context that we talked about, but often it'll be a reasonable choice. But I think the World Bank, I think the World Bank is actually extremely influential, and that's one of the ways it's influential. And, you know, some people would say that's bad. I'm sure there are cases where that's bad, but you know, sometimes that can be very useful as well. So, you know, you know, I've done a lot of work on deworming, and that's an area where the World Health Organization's recommendation of mass deworming in areas with prevalence, worm prevalence above a certain level has been really influential. And the World Bank has developed a practice of bringing together ministries of education, ministries of health, and joint task forces, and that I think was, you know, very influential. And I think you know, some of the academic evidence on the impacts of deworming has been influential, in part directly with, you know, I've talked to Permanent Secretary of Education in Kenya was very alive to all this, but also I think these intermediary institutions played a role. And then, you know, Indian states started adopting, and eventually the Indian government adopted, and the nationally, and I think that was, you know, I think part of the reason is they just saw other Indian states were doing it, and they said, you know, they'll do it. But I don't think the final decision was necessarily based primarily on evidence. It may have been based on looking at what other policymakers are doing. But they were influenced by evidence indirectly.
So, if I may, I think we'll need to close now. And I just, if we could thank the panel in the UK. Thank you.